Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Adult and Pediatric Institute podcast. My name is Nicole. I am your podcast host. First, let me start with you're going to have to excuse my voice a little bit. We were up in Umatilla, Florida all week with the Florida Outs doing our autism testing up there. And I swear I must be allergic to every single tree that's up in Umatilla. It's absolutely gorgeous up there with all the mossy oaks and everything. But every time I go up there this time of year, my allergies just kick up. So my voice is a little bit not so great, but that's okay. We're going to get through this. So I was originally going to do this podcast about IEPs and 504s, and don't worry, I'm absolutely going to do that podcast so that I can share some information about IEPs and 504. I'm trying to get someone from Fiddlers, FDLRS, to come onto the podcast so that we can talk about it. And so I am still working on that. But I wanted to pivot with this podcast because RFK Jr., who is the head of the Department of Health and Human Services, did a press release yesterday. And it was all about autism, my favorite topic, a topic that I have been completely entrenched in, both on a personal level and a professional level for the last 5 years straight. And a lot of what he said was pretty misleading. So, first of all, I had a really intense emotional reaction to that press conference. And I don't do that. That doesn't happen to me, right? So I can watch political debates. I can watch politicians say sometimes the craziest things, and I don't have any sort of emotional reaction to it. It might trigger me to want to do something like write a letter to my congressperson or whatever, but I'm not going to have an emotional reaction. Yesterday, I had an emotional reaction, and I think it's because some of the things that he said, they just hit a little bit too close to home for me. It wasn't just, hey, what you're saying might affect the field that I work in and the population that I love. It's affecting my family. It's affecting my children. And so thankfully, I watched this with our psychometrist, Marina, and Dr. P. We kind of watched it as a team last night at the dinner table in Umatilla. And we processed together and we talked about some of the things that he said, what that may potentially impact in our field and in the healthcare field, and talked about some ideas of what can we do about this. So this podcast, I want to just clear up some of what he said. I'm going to start with the positives of what he said because that's probably a shorter list. And I'm sorry if my laughing is off-putting or it makes it seem like I don't take this seriously, because trust me, I absolutely take this. It's as serious as a heart attack. But that's my coping mechanism, is I kind of laugh at the ridiculousness of it, because what else are you going to do? Cry? I did that last night. So today's the day that we talk it out and we process together as a community. So I think one of the positive things that he said, and I talked about this on my last podcast episode about the autism politics, is autism rates are on the rise. A part of that is because of better diagnostic standards, that the stigma has decreased, that people are seeking answers for their behaviors and their children's behavior, that people were misdiagnosed because the diagnostic criteria has changed. And if you want to hear more about that, listen to the last podcast. I talk more in depth on that. But they are on the rise, and there may be some sort of environmental impact. I agree with that. I agree with what he said on that. There might be an environmental impact. It might be something in our food. It might be a toxin that we're exposed to. It might be something going on with the mother, with the father, whatever it may be. But where he focused that environmental impact coming into play is completely false. That has been disproven. It's a conspiracy theory. It's false. It's just flat out false, period. If there were to be an environmental impact, which I think there may be, it would be impacting the mother or potentially the father prior to either A, them getting pregnant, or B, more likely somewhere during the first trimester, that there's an exposure that's causing a genetic mutation. There is nothing wrong with wanting to bring together the scientific community to say, hey, let's figure this out. Let's find out what's going on. I think that that's brilliant. If he had gone on to this press conference, this press release, and just said, I want to get to the bottom as to why autism rates are going up. I want to take a scientific approach. I want to take an unbiased approach. I'm going to pull together the scientific community. We're going to create some grants. We're going to give it to the best scientists in our country, potentially in the world, to collaborate. And we're going to get to the bottom of this. And it's going to be unbiased scientists. It's going to be people that are experts in this field. And we're going to get us some answers as to why autism diagnosis rates are going up and the prevalence of autism is going up. If he left it at that, that would have been a great press conference. But somewhere along the line, politicians have decided that their opinion matters. It doesn't, not in that position. There is no room for your subjective opinion when we are talking about healthcare, science, facts. I don't care what your opinion is. I don't care what conspiracy theorists you believe in. Great, you want to believe in a conspiracy theory? Find me an unbiased scientist that's going to prove it right. That's what I care about. I care about objective data, appropriate data. There's also a problem in the scientific field known as bias. If you are going into a research study with a certain level of bias, you will find a way for your hypothesis to become a self-fulfilling prophecy. That is whether you are intentionally doing it or unintentionally doing it. If you are looking to get a specific answer, you may subconsciously only recruit scientists that have a history of thinking like you do and giving you that answer. That is not real science. That is not how science should be done. Science is unbiased, objective data. Your opinion does not flippin' matter. And I'm sorry, I'm not going to get mad. My husband told me, and this was a really insightful piece of advice that he gave to me. He said, babe, if you go onto this podcast and you're all angry and you start yelling on this podcast, everyone who doesn't know either side of the story one way or the other, the same people that I'm afraid that they might actually believe some of the stuff that he said yesterday, those same people, they're just going to hear you yelling and they're going to say, well, this lady's just angry and she's crazy and we're not going to listen to her, and they'll turn off the podcast. So if I start to get a little bit too riled up, I will check myself and I will check my emotions, because again, it's not about my opinion. It's about facts. So let's start to break down a little bit, and I'm not going to do comprehensive. This isn't like watch with me while I talk about the things that are coming out of his mouth. That's not what this is going to be. That's silly. But I will break down some of the key points that he talked about and clear up some of these myths. So first of all, the Administration for Health America, Chronic Disease Division, the fact that the autism research that's funded by our government that was typically at the CDC through the ADDM program, that's now going to be rolled into this chronic disease division. That's going to create its own subset of issues. First of all, autism is not a chronic disease. This isn't something you catch and then you are battling this disease until maybe you get cured. That's not how autism works. And that's part of that bias, right? So if we're putting it in the chronic disease division, there we go. That's step one of us potentially creating a bias right out the gate. Another problem with that, I love the idea of having real-time data of diagnosis rates. Here's the downside to the real-time data thing is when providers are prescribing, they have to go into a system and that whatever they're prescribing gets put into that system and it's widespread. Now, imagine that for autism. So let's say there is a person that is diagnosed with autism. As providers, if we want real-time data, we're going to have to go into a system to log that diagnosis. That gets into some murky waters. A lot of what I tell my clients with an autism diagnosis is you're in the driver's seat of who knows about this diagnosis. If you choose to do absolutely nothing with this diagnosis, that's your right, because there is still a stigma there. So now we're somehow going to have to log these individuals into a database for them to collect data and track this. That makes me nervous. Another problem with it going into the chronic disease division, and a problem with him calling this an epidemic, is that does not apply here. So again, we're going back to that subconscious or that self-fulfilling prophecy of something that you eat probably gave you autism. Did you have that applesauce for dinner? Be careful, it might give you autism. That's silly. That's not how autism works. We know this. So when we're calling it an epidemic, what an epidemic is, definition, a widespread occurrence of an infectious disease in a community at a particular time. That means that the undercurrent, the tone of that statement is implying that autism is an infectious disease. If you watched the press conference, you saw the psychologist get up on stage, which shame on him. But anyways, you saw the psychologist get up on stage and you watched him dance around the word epidemic because he, in his right mind, could not feed into that narrative that autism is an epidemic. By definition, it is not. It is not infectious. You will not catch autism from someone. I promise. It is not a disease. It is not an infectious disease. It should not be in that same category. Another big comment that he made was boys being at more risk of having autism. That's not true. Boys are actually at more risk of getting diagnosed with autism. Studies have shown that autism does not discriminate against genders. That also means that it has nothing to do with a Y chromosome or an X chromosome that gives you autism. All of these little scientific facts that we find that come about, it starts to point us in the right direction of getting down to some real answers. So if we knew that boys were more at risk of having autism, then we could conclude that maybe we need to look at the Y chromosome. Maybe there's something going on within that Y chromosome that's causing autism. They are not at more risk of having autism. They're at equal risk as females. Boys just tend to be diagnosed more often. That's it. The reason why they're diagnosed, again, I talk about it in my last podcast. It has a lot to do with stereotypic gender norms, how we treat boys versus how we treat girls. There's a lot of social implication there. Another thing that he said is move away from the reason for autism rates going up is because of better diagnostic standards and stigma. That's absurd. That does come into play with it. That absolutely comes into play with that. Is it the only reason? No, probably not. There's other reasons, I'm sure. I don't know. I haven't done any scientific studies on this. There's brilliant scientists out there that are doing this. But that is still part of it. It comes into play with it. The big one that got me, that he said, the thing that I had a visceral reaction to, meaning I literally got sick to my stomach and I wanted to just cry, is at the end with the questions from the people that were at the press conference, he started to go more and more into his conspiracy theories, more and more into his opinion. His opinion, I'm sure in whatever field he's a specialist in, which I don't know what that is, I'm sure it matters in that area. He is not an autism specialist. He is not a doctor. He is not a scientist. He is not a psychologist. He has not gone to school for this. He is not a specialist. I don't care what your opinion is. And his opinion that they will never play baseball. People with autism will never go on a date. People with autism will never pay their taxes. That made me sick to my stomach. We have worked so hard as an autism community to make people more aware, to not be afraid of people with autism, to not shy away from them, to not put them in a corner, put them in a box, tell them they will never be something. I have worked so hard with my own children on this topic of you can be anything you want to be. Don't ever let the autism get in your way. Use it as a strength. Do not treat it as a weakness that will prevent you from being anything you want to be. He undid that. That's where I got really upset. And I get really upset because he used this really powerful position and speaking platform to put my kids back in a box. And so I don't know if you noticed, but the image that I chose for this podcast episode is my daughter killing it at softball. Because guess what? My autistic kid plays softball and she picked it up really naturally. She doesn't play it anymore because she didn't like it. She didn't like having to wear all those clothes and the socks and all that. That's that sensory. But when she did play it, she killed it. She killed it out there on the softball field. That's nonsense. I mean, if you want to tell me that my kids, my girls, won't have to pay taxes, I mean, I guess that's kind of cool, right? They don't have to pay taxes. But that's silly. That is not true. It is a spectrum. He had made a comment of very contradictory. In one breath, he is saying that people with autism headbang and it's severe and it's profound. And he's saying all of these symptoms of someone with profound autism. And he calls them the majority of people. And then in the next breath, he's saying, well, but that's 20% of people with autism. I'm sorry. I don't know where you went to school to learn statistics, but I'm pretty sure we don't consider 20% a majority, right? Majority would be over 50%. And so it's just not true. That is a subset of people with autism. That's part of the spectrum. That's why we call it a spectrum, because someone can fall anywhere on the spectrum. On that same topic, when he started saying, why don't we see autistic adults walking through the mall, headbanging? There's no institutions, there's no group homes for them. So why aren't we seeing more autistic adults? It's clearly only affecting children since 1990. Oh my goodness, come on. That is so silly. Here's why it's silly. If you don't know why it's silly, I'm going to tell you why it's silly. First of all, there absolutely are group homes. There's not enough of them, but there are group homes. Second of all, you have a 40-year-old that is an autistic adult. They have lived their whole life out in society. They have managed to survive, managed to exist. They have done their part in society. That same adult, when they were a child, they were completely nonverbal. They banged their head. They had a lot of self-harming behaviors. They couldn't go out into society without having dangerous self-harming behaviors and meltdowns. So their parents saw this, or the individuals in their life saw this, and they either A, were institutionalized, got access to a lot of therapies, especially if we're talking, kind of back in the day when he was referencing, or B, they got therapies in home, or their parents or their teachers worked with them on these behaviors. So these behaviors over time started to decrease. Now they're at a point where maybe they're still nonverbal, but they have other means of communication. Verbal communication is not the only communication. Look at Stephen Hawking. He didn't have autism, he had ALS, but he had nonverbal communication. He used an AAC device. That man was still brilliant and went on to continue to be brilliant even when he lost the means for verbal communication. So maybe they're still nonverbal, but they don't headbang anymore. They're able to go to the mall. They have enough coping mechanisms where they can walk through the mall. And if you didn't know any better, you would think that they were a neurotypical human being, because autism does not have a look to it, right? We're not talking about any physical characteristics that with some other genetic disorders. And so you absolutely still see autistic adults. I promise you. Look at Elon Musk, right? There you go. Let's put Elon Musk and RFK Jr. in a room together a little bit more often. And maybe he'll get off that tangent that there's no autistic adults. There absolutely are. And so that was pretty shameful and offensive towards autistic adults, that statement. The last thing I want to talk about is what he said about autism is not genetic, but then he started saying, but it is genetic. And so that was all very, very confusing. There's been a lot of scientific research by some really brilliant people. I talked about Dr. Geschwind in my last podcast, who studies autism and genetics. Autism is being shown to be genetic. It is genetic. It is in your genes. Another thing that he said, that your genes do not dictate your behaviors. If you took my genetics class back when I was teaching, you know that that's not true, right? Your genes absolutely impact your behaviors, and the expression of your genes will impact how you behave to a certain degree. Nurture, your environment, also comes into play. It's both. We know this. And again, listen to my last podcast. It was almost perfect timing right before his press release, because he clearly didn't listen to it. I'm going to send him a link to it, because we can't keep going down this whole conspiracy theory. I just can't anymore, guys. We've got to stop with this. We've got to stop with people getting on TV and sharing their uneducated opinion to the millions of listeners out there that are also not educated in this. And so they're going to listen to what they say, and they're going to say, okay, that makes sense. Yeah, let's do that. That's a problem, and it's scary. And I think that's part of what led us in our country to the position that we're in. I am a big believer in freedom of speech. I fought in the military for the right for people to say things that I disagree with. I think that it's hypocritical and contradictory if I try to silence someone for saying something that I disagree with. That's not what I fought for in the military. That's not why I spent 3.5 years floating on a boat, being exposed to all sorts of trauma. I didn't fight for people to lose their freedom of speech. You absolutely have freedom of speech. I have the freedom of speech to come onto my podcast and say my opinions, my feelings about what he said. Where we go wrong is when someone in a powerful position gets on TV or uses their platform to talk about things that they are not educated about. There's a saying, the more I learn, the more I realize I have so much to learn. I don't know anything. And I paraphrase that saying, so don't slay me if I didn't get it exact. But that's true. The more I learn in my field, and the more I learn in my career and throughout life, the more I realize I don't know anything. I would never get on TV and pretend to talk about something that I don't know. I will deflect and I will defer, or the answer is, I don't have the answer to that, but I can get you the answer. I can find someone who does. He did that. And that's sad to me, because I fear what's going to happen with the things that he said. What type of snowball is that going to create in our country? All of the funding that we're getting for early intervention, early diagnosis, things like that. What happens to that funding? What happens to wait lists for people waiting for a diagnosis? What happens to services? What happens to vaccination rates? What happens to things that are a part of the epidemic, such as measles? Are we going to encourage people to go back to that? What happens to cancer rates and smoking? Because what he said was incredibly misleading, that smoking does not necessarily cause cancer. That's silly. That's not true. What he said had some truth to it, that genetics do also come into play with smoking and cancer, but smoking greatly increases the risk. He did not tell the whole story. He said snippets of pieces of truth, and it was very misleading. So we're all going to take a deep breath. Ready? Do it. Breathe in, breathe out. We're going to woosah. We're going to do what we need to do to clean up some of the mess that might be caused by things that he said. And we're going to calm down, and we're going to process, our feelings and our emotions, and then we're going to pick ourselves up and we're going to act. And we're going to decide as a community, what do we want to do about this? Maybe we have a march. Maybe we have a protest. Maybe I fly my 8-year-old daughter with autism up to Washington and set up a meeting with him so that he can put a face to autism. He can put a different face of the spectrum. These are human beings that we're talking about. How dare you put them in a box and say that they will never be whole humans? That's not okay in my eyes. That's where I get emotional. But emotions can't drive our decisions. What can drive our decisions is thoughts and facts and coming together as a community, because one voice may not be that loud, but all of our voices together, that's what really makes waves, and that's what resonates. That's where change comes from. We have the power as a community to change things. It happened in Vietnam. It happened with racism. We have the power to change things. Don't ever feel like you are a victim to our government. We have the power to vote people into office. We have the power to vote them out of office. We have the power to educate people. So please use your voice. Let's come together as an autism community, and let's continue to educate people on what autism really is. I hope you got something out of this podcast. I hope you didn't turn it off when I started getting all loud and used a word like flippin'. At least I didn't curse. I was good about that, right? Although in my house, that word, we do actually consider that a curse word, because when my kids say it, I'm like, yeah, but I know what you meant. And that's not okay either. Hopefully you got something from this. And I look forward to coming together as a community and moving forward from here and continuing educating. Thank you. Go out and conquer your day.